The year was 1914. Wireless was in its infancy and the great powers locked in war. There were no domestic broadcast stations, and only the real enthusiast was aware of the marvels of wireless telegraphy. Prior to 1914, the majority of British experimenters, as they were termed on the licence, were confined to monitoring the long-wave telegraphy transmissions of places like Poldhu in Cornwall, Clifton in County Galway, and the time signals originating from Foxtrot Lima, the transmitter installed in the Eiffel Tower in Paris. Also receivable was the spark transmission of Nauen just outside Berlin, which was reputed to be the most powerful transmitter in the world at this time. All experimental licenses were withdrawn at the outbreak of war, and equipment was dismantled and confiscated by the authorities. The Defence of the Realm Consolidation Act was passed on the 16th of October 1914. The official regulations stated that no person shall use or possess a wireless telegraphic apparatus, or a component part, or parts thereof capable of being used for transmission or reception of wireless signals. Now that is quite a mouthful, but it basically meant no wireless. The maximum penalty for this offence was a £100 fine or 6 months in prison with hard labour without the option of a fine. Now this was a big deal back then. £100 was a hell of a lot of money, and the shame of being prosecuted for anything was hard to deal with. Even a technical, accidental offence was severely dealt with. A. Campbell Swinton, president of the Wireless Society of London, had suggested that amateurs could play a role in detecting illicit transmissions, but the offer was declined by the authorities. The Society's secretary, R.H. Klein, tried again in a letter to the Times, pointing out the advantages of such a move, but to no avail. The government, by all accounts, wished for a complete blackout on all things wireless, and seemed to want the word to disappear. During the early years of war, violators of this ruling were often severely dealt with. In 1915, William Thompson, described as a labourer, was sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment at Blyth Police Court for possessing wireless apparatus. Thompson's defence was that he was not communicating or even monitoring other stations. He was, in fact, trying to develop the idea of steering ships at sea from a land position. This evidence was corroborated by colleagues who reported Thompson's tests were carried out with a model yacht on Ridley Park Lake. Thompson was obviously pioneering radio control, and considering the very basic components available at this time, his achievements were, to say the least, remarkable. However, this had little effect on the bench. They appeared to take more note of a post office expert who reported the apparatus could transmit over a radius of 5 miles under favourable conditions. Under ordinary conditions, the range would be 2 miles. He would of course need an aerial, but items that could be used as an aerial had been found in Thompson's house. His solicitors maintained that Thompson was an Englishman with no desire to be a traitor. Only a technical offence had been committed which didn't call for a severe penalty. The chairman said that the bench could not ignore the man's extraordinary ability, and the fact that these devices would have been of grave danger and menace to the state if used in the wrong direction. The northeast of England also seemed to have a spate of illegal wireless prosecutions in 1915. Clifton Gossman, an apprentice fitter, was charged at Newcastle Police Court with having in his possession apparatus intended to be used as a component part of an installation for receiving messages by wireless telegraphy. The prosecution didn't suggest that there was any wireless installation on the premises, or that the defendant intended to set one up. Gossman had apparently called voluntarily at the police station and handed over minor articles. Other items subsequently discovered in the house were covered in dust and had obviously not been touched for some time. The bench dismissed the defendant's plea that he had not read the regulations and imposed a penalty of 20 shillings or 13 days imprisonment. Schoolteacher William Walker was fined 5 guineas at Castle Eden in County Durham for being in possession of wireless apparatus. A police sergeant visiting Walker's home was shown parts of a dismantled aerial which had been taken down shortly after the outbreak of war. Walker said he didn't know Morse code but used the equipment to receive the time signal from Fox Lima in Paris. A post office engineer said that it would take about 2 days to reassemble the equipment to receive messages, and it couldn't transmit at all. Sanity prevailed in another Castle Eden case when another school teacher, 54-year-old Robert Linkay, was brought before the court. He was charged with having wireless apparatus in his possession. The defendant admitted to having the equipment which he had been using during the previous 10 years to teach the principles of wireless to his pupils. An engineer giving evidence said that the equipment was practically useless for receiving messages from any modern station. He agreed that it could transmit, but said the range would be extremely limited. The chairman of the bench said that they were not satisfied that the summons had been taken out on the right party, and the case was dismissed, but all apparatus confiscated. The possession of a Morse key appeared to have been the downfall of Matthew Reed, a mechanic in the postal department in Victoria, London. He was charged with having in his possession apparatus capable of being used for tapping wireless telegraphy messages. The chairman said he didn't think Reed intended to aid the enemy, but nevertheless imposed a fine of £20 with 4 guineas in costs. At Gateshead Court, Frederick Askew was convicted for a similar offence. When a detective called at the house, the accused produced certain parts from an overcoat pocket. He stated that a friend of his held the other items which they'd purchased between them for 25 shillings. A post office engineer gave evidence that it would be possible to receive messages by using the other parts of the apparatus, but they weren't capable of transmitting information. Askew was fined 20 shillings and warned that he had been liable to a £100 fine. A confrontation between a defendant and a witness at a Ramsgate prosecution was quite interesting as well. Richard Softley was accused of possessing 1 tuner, 1 detector, 3 coils of insulated wire, 1 telephone receiver and 3 testing buzzers. The defence claimed that the equipment had been used to train Boy Scouts under very localised conditions, the aerial being supported by broomsticks. Warrant telegraphist Harford gave evidence that the Navy had experienced frequent interruptions to wireless traffic. He said it wasn't possible to say where the interference came from, but alleged the defendant's apparatus was capable of a 4 or 5 mile range. This led to a cross-examination. The defendant said, "Do you consider my pole, 2 broomsticks, sufficient to support an aerial?" To which the witness replied, "Yes." The defendant then said, "Could you wire the seized apparatus up in 4 hours?" And the witness said, "Yes, it was quite possible." The defendant then asked, "How long have you been in the wireless authority?" And the witness said, "About 3 years." To which the defendant replied, "Then you've wasted your time." The defendant was subsequently fined £15 or 6 months in prison. A case that was at the time locally referred to as the Enfield sensation was heard before Enfield Petty Sessions early in 1915. Stanley White, aged 17, was a student at the East London Wireless College and apparently a very enthusiastic one. He was arrested during the small hours in suspicious circumstances, moving around on the roof of houses adjacent to the Enfield telephone exchange. An almost complete wireless station was later discovered at his home, and Stanley had been finalising the work by erecting an aerial. The post office who were prosecuting alleged that when established, the equipment would be capable of transmitting and receiving messages to and from Germany. Stanley White emphatically denied receiving messages or transmitting them, but admitted he could send and receive 18 words of Morse code per minute. The GPO stated that if the accused could read Morse code at only 12 words per minute, he would be able to interpret messages. On the facts recorded, this seemed a blatant violation of the Defence of the Realm Act. However, possibly because he was a student of wireless, he was only fined £7 with 3 guineas in costs. Now, the maximum sentence pronounced on this act was at a court-martial held in Hull in December of 1914. It referred to Archibald Cox of Filey in Yorkshire, who was a licensed and respected transmitting amateur for several years. He appeared to have been guilty of merely retaining a small portable set, partially dismantled, in his possession. Cox's house was raided by the military on the 18th of October 1914, just 2 days after the Defence of the Realm Act was published. Mr. J.B. Tucker, Honourable Secretary of the Birmingham Wireless Association, publicised his case in a letter to Wireless World and emphasised the following points. Number 1. No charges of attempted communications with the enemy had been made. Number 2. Mr. Cox's character wasn't doubted. Number 3. A letter from the Postmaster General read out in court stressed that they had no desire to press the case. And number 4. The necessary aerial for communication had been dismantled earlier in the year when all of the stations had been closed down. In spite of these facts for what was all a purely technical offence, Cox was sentenced to the maximum of 6 months imprisonment. Part of this was remitted due to already spending 7 weeks in custody, but 2 months had yet to be served. A supporting letter in the Cox case highlighted an instance of a German who was caught with a fully operational wireless station established on the Essex coast. It was connected to the mains and capable of sending over 100 miles. For this, the convicted man was only sentenced to 3 months detention without hard labour, and, upon comparison, the unnecessary severity of Cox's sentence was astonishing. Now, what was particularly sad about this period is that honourable men of good character were to receive and carry with them to the deaths the stigma of the conviction. For a careless oversight they were branded, and with the patriotic feeling at the time, it's reasonable to assume that their families were also forced to endure the shame. In one case, the father of a convicted youth went to great lengths to destroy the rumour that he had relatives in Germany. Partly to blame was the mystery of wireless. Dignitaries and officials in high places knew little of the intricacies of electromagnetic waves, and appeared to have been alarmed and dismayed that their socially inferiors did.